All right, everyone, welcome back to the Energeia podcast. This is Dr. G, as always, joining you today. And today my guests are Douglas-Kenrick and David Lundberg-Kenrick. Doug is professor of psychology at Arizona State University, whose work has integrated cognitive science and evolutionary psychology in order to study a broad range of human cognitive and behavioral phenomena, including mate selection, economic decision-making, consumption, creativity, conformity, and aggression, to name but only a few areas he's probed into. He is the author of the book Sex, Murder, and the Meaning of Life, as well as a regular contributor at Psychology Today with a blog of the same name, and is the co-author of the book The Rational Animal: How Evolution Made Us Smarter Than We Think. Doug has published extensively throughout the major academic psychology and cognitive science journals, with his research having been funded by the National Science Foundation and the National Institute of Mental Health, and he's been covered in national and international media, including the New York Times and Newsweek, as well as featuring in outlets like Scientific American. He has also edited several books and textbooks on evolutionary and social psychology, and has appeared on several BBC and Discovery Channel documentaries, as well as the Oprah Winfrey Show. Dave is Media Outreach Director for the Psychology Department at Arizona State University, where he also directs the Psych for Life program, which is designed to link psychological research to everyday problems encountered by everyday humans. Dave studied film production at New York University and the University of Texas at Austin, and has also worked as an animator, video editor, and video producer, having worked on various documentaries and television shows on the BBC and Discovery Channel. He also wrote a blog for Psychology Today entitled The Caveman Goes to Hollywood, which analyzed popular movies through the lens of evolutionary psychology, and also co-hosted a popular podcast, Zombified, about the ways people are unwittingly parasitized by everything from microscopic organisms to multinational corporations. Dave is also the co-author of the 7th edition of Social Psychology Goals and Interaction, alongside Doug and others, for which he was involved in producing animations and research videos for a number of psychology researchers, and is also Doug's son. Hence the shared Kenrick, not simply a coincidence. Doug, Dave, welcome along. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Great to be here.
Thanks for having us.
No worries. A real pleasure to have you guys here. And now you guys have written this really superb book that I've just finished reading a couple of days ago in full, called Solving Modern Problems with a Stone Age Brain, that we're going to discuss today, and for which, for me personally, was almost the perfect intersection of my two main professional loves and interests as a scholar and as a practitioner, namely individual development and the practical application of evolutionary science. And in my own practice as a coach and a consultant, I routinely use evolutionary insights to help my clients make better sense of their own ambitions and aspirations, their neuroses and inadequacies, why they experience unfulfillment or anxiety over how they're tracking in their life and career, things like that. And one thing I consistently notice is how especially persuasive and compelling an evolutionary framing in general is in these areas, and specifically in evolutionary mismatch framing. In my experience, there really is something that seems to land with people in a really appreciable way when you relate to them this idea that their life in the modern world is so psychophysiologically divorced from the overall environmental context that we're adapted to as a species, that we're experiencing all the vagaries of civilized life while operating outside of a state of nature. So for me, this book was really a massive affirmation of ideas that myself and so many of my clients had already found so tremendously powerful and generative. But for our listeners who are maybe yet to hear the good word about how understanding the ancestry of our species can help inform their lives and guide their development, let me tee you up with a quote from the introduction to your book. You quote, "Learned that incredibly powerful, scientifically validated principles can really help solve the fundamental problems of human existence, and that you've also learned that the advice in the most popular self-help books, quote unquote, although often based on common sense intuition, is often not useful, is usually oversimplified, and sometimes is actually counterproductive. So Doug, Dave, what can the theory of evolution and the ancestral past of our species teach us about real self-help and real self-development that the magic formula book with the, you know, pearl-toothed author on the cover that you picked up at the airport bookstore, what can this teach us that those books can't?
Well, I think, as you pointed out, taking an evolutionary perspective is something that they don't typically do. So your standard advice book it's a laundry list full of nice things that, you know, your grandmother might have told you, and often they're right, but often as not they're wrong, or they don't apply in every situation. And so by asking the question of what are the sort of basic things that human beings really need, and how are we designed to relate to one another? So, you know, we have this rebuilt Maslow's pyramid, and I think that's, you know, so our book has a theoretical structure, you know, and not in a not an abstract, just for scientists kind of a theoretical way. It's just, I think it's very useful to think about things in an organized, we can remember a lot more when we organize it. And so our pyramid, based on Maslow's old pyramid, it says, look, in the social world, first of all, we need to survive, okay? We need to protect ourselves from snakes and, you know, starvation. Second of all, and this is sort of developmentally, when you're a kid, a baby, first, all they do is they want nutrition, okay? Next, they want to get protected from the bad guys. They start to get mobile, and then they develop stranger anxiety, okay? And all these things continue into adulthood. We're still afraid of strangers as adults, which in the modern world is a little bit, as you pointed out, mismatched, because we have to confront members of other tribes and get along with other members of people of other groups, which our ancestors didn't really have to do. They didn't do it. They killed one another, you know. Then next up developmentally, you know, kids want to make some friends. They want to affiliate. And again, our ancestors really needed one another. We're naked apes running around the plains of northern Africa in groups were dangerous, okay? You know, Bill von Hippel has this lovely book in which he talks about how good we are at throwing rocks. And you get, you know, 8 humans throwing rocks, and they can do a lot of damage to even to a dangerous predator. But one human alone, not so dangerous, okay? And so we need each other. We depend upon each other. And again, in the modern world, we are confronted with these interesting opportunities like Facebook and, you know, various kinds of social media, ways to relate to one another. And, you know, you'd think, well, this is great, right? This is all great. We've got more than our ancestors had. But we'll get to that in a second, that we actually in some ways have less than they had. Then the next few steps are status. You know, I noticed in Dave's younger brother, when he was going, first went to preschool, he could care less what other people thought of him. Then, you know, about the, you know, 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, he started to be worried about the, you know, how the other people looked up or looked down on him. Then when you reach puberty, you start being interested in seeking mates, which we're not actually naturally that well equipped to do, especially in the modern world, because in the ancestral world, we didn't have that many choices. Marriages might have been arranged, or they were just like, this is who's there for you. Now in the modern world, we've got, you know, these dating apps. Then you could be looking at people, you know, in New Zealand if you were in Phoenix, Arizona, and think about dating them. So anybody in the world is an option. Again, you'd think that's great, but not so. Then there's a different problem. Once you've found a mate, you need to keep a mate, you know, depending upon your different mating strategies. But our ancestors tended to bond together because human offspring, just like we're naked and helpless alone out on the grasslands of northern Africa, a human baby has this big head, very hungry, weighs down the mother, doesn't walk for a couple of years. And so having the fathers, basically parental cooperation, evolved in human beings, okay? So that the father stays around. And, you know, I'm now traveling with, I wrote a book with Dave. I'm traveling with his son and my son. And that's not that unusual in our species, you know, a parental father and grandfather still contribute to the offspring. Not true in 96% of mammals, okay? But a problem we've got to solve. And then finally, taking care of those. You have these offspring, and you want to take care of them, and then it all starts all over again, trying to raise somebody up through that same pyramid. So that's the framework of our book. And the way that a typical chapter is structured is we actually went and looked at the anthropological literature. What's it like to be a Yanomamo or a Mai Sin living in, on a little island in the Philippines, or someone living on the Kalahari Desert in a hunter-gatherer group, and how did they confront those problems? And then we ask, how's it different in the modern world? And then a final thing that we talk about is very frequent. You talked about mismatch, that the mechanisms we have for solving those problems were great, even 20,000 years ago. And in some ways, they're still great now, okay? But some of them are not. They're mismatched, to use your word, which is, I think, a great word. But there's another thing, that even beyond mismatch. We have these powerful motivations, okay? We really crave, food. We crave calories, and technology can give it to us in a way that our ancestors could never have. We really crave friendship, and Facebook can give it to us in a way our ancestors could have never had. We really crave mates, and OkCupid can give it to us in ways our ancestors never had. And in some ways you think that's great, but actually it turns out that a lot of the research evidence suggests that, for example, kids who use social media, you would think they'd be happier, they've got more contact with their friends. They're actually less happy than kids who don't use social media, And kids who have face-to-face contact with their friends, the more face-to-face contact you have with your friends, the happier you are. So, I'll give you one more example, the classic example that anybody who's read a little evolutionary psych knows, but it's the Elvis Presley problem. Elvis Presley had lots of money, lived in the modern world. He could eat whatever he wanted. And this handsome young guy, one of the world's best looking young guys, turned into a very obese, so it got to be 350 pounds or so. And he died very young, in his early 40s, I think, of a heart attack, okay, because he could have whatever he wanted. And so he just, he kept, there's one guy we talked about in the book who got up to 1,197 pounds. And that couldn't have happened in the ancestral environment because our ancestors had to walk all day. Kim Hill, our anthropological colleague at ASU, points out, and a lot of hunter-gatherers live long lives, but they never die of heart attacks if they live into their 70s because they're trim and slim and they don't have Ben and Jerry's. So, what we suggest is that these powerful motives have opened up marketing opportunities for industry to give us more than we ever could have had, and in some ways it's killing us. Some ways we can't handle it.
Yeah, and look, I mean, I love the example of Elvis because nothing really is more emblematic of our civilizational malaise than, like you said, one of the world's most handsome, sought-after guys dying obese and tubby on the toilet, having mainline cheeseburgers and God knows what other, scripted or unscripted pharmaceuticals over the previous some odd years as his career began to sort of nosedive somewhat. So yeah, I mean, I think that's very sort of emblematic of where we've arrived at, and I appreciate the kind of the quick and dirty tour guide up the rungs of the pyramid there. But let's go through each of these levels on the pyramid individually, because you lay them out sequentially in the book, and I think they're all worth addressing individually. The second chapter of the book and the base level of your pyramid of human motives and fulfillment is all about basic survival, somewhat akin to what Maslow established as his base of the pyramid as well, that the physical sustainment of yourself as this modern version of an ancient animal, and all the different ways that modern life conspires to hijack our psychological faculties against the service of our own physical interests. I mean, to me, you mentioned diet before. I mean, to me, the most powerful example here is diet. It's pretty staggering just how much carnage is wrought upon our species simply because people, eat like shit due to their evolved capacities for fat and glucose acquisition being deployed in a world where you can sit on your ass in the Dunkin' Donuts drive-thru and demolish 3,000 calories of nutritionally bankrupt deliciousness before you've even left the parking lot, right? But it's not obviously just the food we eat. There seem to be psychological traps out there to sabotage our physical well-being at every turn. So, in addition to diet, maybe feel free to expand on diet as well. But could you run us through what some of the main things we need to be wary of are, and what we can do to avoid or mitigate the worst excesses in our daily lives?
Dave, I wonder if you had a thought on that, since Dave does some dangerous things.
Oh, well, there's dangerous things like climbing and things, but I enjoy those sorts of things. I was actually just thinking, one of the big challenges for modern life right now is shelter, right? Shelter in Arizona, Phoenix, a lot of the U.S. housing is so hard for people to find. And so I think that these sorts of things of figuring out how to acquire not just food, but shelter is a trick. And I think, I think those are the two in terms of things we want to achieve. And then there's a third one in which I think is something that we need to sort of be thinking about as a group, which is water. We're running out of water. And so now that's not to say that we have ancestral solutions to these, but it guides. Being aware of how important these things are can guide some other decisions, which we could talk about a bit further down the line.
So, one of the things we talked about in that chapter at the end, well, we go through the things that killed people in the ancestral environment, okay? And there were things like falling from trees. I was making that comment to Dave because Dave likes to rock climb, okay? And I'm always, thinking, this is so dangerous. Our ancestors commonly died from falling, which we don't tend to so much, okay? They died in accidents, and we die in car accidents. We don't die in the same kinds of accidents they died in. They died of infectious diseases, but not the kind we get. They didn't die of influenza and COVID and things like that. They died from things like cutting up dead animals and having it cut and getting some parasitic organism from the meats they were eating. They didn't spread, they didn't have much contact with outside groups, so they didn't get the same kinds of diseases we got. But when they did get diseases, they had very little, they didn't have any medicine to deal with them, so they would die. They had tremendous amounts of infants dying, which we don't. More infants died than lived, I think, in the ancestral environment. The average woman had like 8 children, and she was lucky if 2 of them survived. But then we talk about, well, what do we die of now? And again, a lot of what we die of things like lung cancer, because we've got cigarettes, and we have all of the pollution we put into the air, right? Things our ancestors didn't so much need to worry about, okay? And so we need to do things like force ourselves to exercise. In the ancestral environment, that wasn't the problem. You had to exercise. There was no car, there was no subway, there was no easy chair to sit on and watch your television. Okay, you moved around all day long. You traveled, an average of, I think, at least 10 miles a day, the average hunter-gatherer, and you didn't have all those calories. So we need to force ourselves to live healthy lives. And so one of the things that Dave suggested is to try to make I forget how you frame it, Dave, but try to make the modern life.
Oh, well, try to make the modern world match the ancestral environment.
Hide the food.
Yes, hide the food. Can we take a quick step back? Because I think there's one other aspect that I think is worth mentioning. And as we go through and we talk about these different levels, I think one of the key things, you'd sort of asked what sort of insights it can provide. And thinking about these things as a framework that not only individual people need to accomplish, but also as a species, right? And how we have to sort of match our own needs with the needs of other people, trying to match those same needs, and also how we have to match our desires for one particular need, like say survival, against another need, like friendship. And I think that's just worth pointing out, because as I was mentioning, the things like the water, right? It's not bad on an individual level for people to drink water, but we're also hitting these sort of group level challenges like overconsumption and things like that. So that is the one thing I wanted to add.
Absolutely. And I'm just thinking as well, Doug, what you were saying about fitness and staying physically fit. The fact that we had no choice but to be fit and physically optimized in some sense. Otherwise, life would blow by you and you wouldn't survive in ancestral times. And it's also made me think about meditation and mindfulness. These are two terms that get bandied about a lot. They're very in vogue. I mean, like I teach at a business school, like mindfulness is hot currency in business psychology these days. And I can't help but feel that there's kind of an analog here with physical fitness, that the reason we have to deliberately cultivate a physical fitness regime these days is because we're not getting the kind of, we're not engaging in the kind of exertive, physically intense labor that we did in our ancestral past. Likewise, I think that the advice that, without wanting to advocate for one protocol or modality or another, I think the advice that we should all have some sort of contemplative mindfulness-based practice these days is a reflection of the fact that in ancestral times, you would have had no choice but to live a somewhat contemplative existence in your own mind, because you're not being bombarded with information at every turn like you are in modern life. So, when you think about it, the average ancestral human, what did they have to think about over the course of a given day? Predatory threats, maybe threats, their spouse committing infidelity or something like that, the climate, but they weren't being, they're not being bombarded with concepts at every turn. And so I feel like, and you guys push back if you disagree with us, but I feel like in modern life, something like meditating or having a mindfulness practice is a necessary antidote to the fact that our ancient brains have been overlaid with conceptual grist in a way that our innate hardware is just not adapted for or optimized for. What do you guys think?
I think that's totally true. And I also think, like, when we're talking about basic needs, so we've talked about shelter and food and things. One of the things that I think you're driving at is time, right? Even if you're living a healthy life, you've only got a limited number of years to accomplish all your other goals. And your notifications and your apps, they will take away that time, right? They'll take away that cognitive ability to focus on other goals. And I think that your own sort of hours in the day are a resource that our ancestors had a lot of, right? And they were only taken by immediate demands, not somebody texting you, hey, can you send me that email? And so I think finding ways to give ourselves not only sort of natural foods, but natural chunks of time is really important.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I like both of those things that you just said. Just because it does strike me that, as you were pointing out, Gareth, you focused on what you needed to in the ancestral environment, but it wasn't like 1,000 things vying for your attention. Now it's, if I go, for example, just going to look for the link to talk to you today, I'm living a sort of a contemplative week because I'm traveling with the boys through the national parks and we're hiking. But I have to yank them away from their machines to get them to get out in the morning, okay? And even now I had to beg them to please, since I'm staying in this Airbnb and I need to be talking on the phone, please don't be hogging the wavelength, all right? Just do something else. And they're like, you're kidding. And when I went on to just get the link, I got all these other emails reminding me of all these other things that I needed to do. And I got advertisements from politicians reminding me of all the dangerous stuff that's happening out there, and I better contribute some money for that, And I got other kinds of advertisements for people selling me some, cool, because I'm hiking, so I bought some hiking clothes. So now I'm getting advertisements in my email box from Columbia, sportswear, offering me sales. And there's just, that's something our ancestors didn't have. They didn't have other people, they had their local group members fighting for one another's attention, but they didn't have just basically everyone in the world trying to grab a piece of their mind. So yeah, that's another interesting way in which making the world more natural is a good thing.
Yeah, I think in the book we talk, I think, about sort of, if you can, park, a little further from work, but also maybe keep your cell phone off, and that's a good time to just think.
And it's a good safeguard. This actually segues nicely. A safeguard against, like helping you to avoid the bullies and the plunderers, as you put it in the book. So, I mean, at 41, I still sometimes feel the residual symptoms of young male syndrome, however mostly benign these might be these days. And I also feel the creep of my own less than helpful responses to heated interactions. And I feel like part of that stems from the amount of information I'm bombarded with every day, and just how much push and pull in my own inner mental world is happening because of that. And when I assess this behavior on my own part in retrospect, when the bad guy in me is sort of coming out a little bit, or I can feel that pull of the bad guy, when I assess that behavior in retrospect, I can tell that it's such an obviously misguided and yet ultimately self-protection minded response. And so to move on to the second rung of the pyramid in the book, how does someone like me, 6'2", 230 pounds, stay hip to the pull of the inner bad guy while also not coming off as a threat to others?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good, obviously there's two sides to the bad guy thing. There's other bad guys, but we don't think of the fact that we might be the bad guy, okay? And we're designed in some sense to, I mean, I still do this. I'm 74 years old tomorrow. I'm 73 today. I'm still a young guy, but tomorrow I'm going to be old. And I still occasionally will give the finger to somebody who cuts me off in traffic and honks at me. Right. And what am I doing? Basically, I've got this ancestral desire to maintain my position in the group and not be disrespected, okay? And it's extremely dangerous. And I don't need, if some guy in Oregon cuts me off, I don't need to defend my reputation, okay? And yet, there I am, kind of wired up to respond to people in traffic as if they are members of my group whose praise and, whose respect I need to maintain. And so, yeah, that's kind of an interest. I mean, one of the things, I forget what we suggest in the book on that one, Dave, but you might remember, but we do suggest to make sure you're not one of the bad guys yourselves, just to basically, ask yourself, does this really matter? Does this interaction really matter? And also, is this person really an enemy of mine who's annoying me right now? But that's definitely, an interesting problem, and it's more of a problem, obviously for males than for females because of sexual selection. That females never went out in groups beating one another up, and they didn't get the same advantages that males got for competing for status. So yeah, it's an interesting problem.
I do want to say that the third thing I think we talk about is that you still, though, there is a good side to that, right? And you can channel that towards standing up for your friends. And that is actually, if you're like, I'm a big guy, and sometimes, let's be honest, sometimes it can be fun to fight a little bit, right? When my dad and I were working on this book, we would argue, we would have these and I think thinking about, all right, you know what? You have strength, you have size. It puts you in a position where you can stand up for people. Use it that way, right? And just sort of consciously think about how you want to use your power, I think, is the other aspect of it. Because sometimes it is worth having a big guy on your side. So
absolutely, as long as that big guy is channeling that big guy power and potency towards productive and profitable ends, I think that's probably the best way we can kind of square that circle.
Before we move on, because I think one of the things we didn't talk about that's a chunk of that chapter is that in the modern world, a lot of the bad guys are sort of like, they're sort of more like mosquitoes. Instead of being big bullies coming over the hill, we've got a lot of little mosquitoes taking little bits of our blood all the time. And, there's, like, for example, the people who are trying to exploit me to make little contributions to their, charity, and the little teeny fees that I get for things that I didn't expect to get. And these are things that are invisible to us. They don't even, if we don't notice them, they don't even kind of activate our angry mechanisms, and yet they're happening. They're basically, we're getting mildly exploited all the time. And it's like mosquitoes. It's not terrible, but it is something that in the end can be, they look at what the average person pays in fees, and it adds up to a lot of money at the end of a year in terms of these little hidden fees that you didn't know were coming, and these little tricky, expenses that they sneak into your bills. And so one of the things we argue there is if a lot of that is happening, what our ancestors did against the bad guys, they band together. It also turns out that people can band together against, like we have one example of a group of people who banded together against a local electric company who was about to sort of sneak by another cheat into their bills. And they banded together and they made a big stink about it, lots of voices, and the electric company backed off.
Right, and then, there's strength in numbers even for these sort of more surreptitious, less, obviously big bad wolf type influences in our lives. Right. Well, to move things to the next chapter, which is a bit more positively and hopefully framed. You talk about the nature of friendship and affiliation, and I think what you discussed in the very first part of that chapter particularly resonated with me. What you discussed about friendship and usefulness not being mutually exclusive. That's something I really personally could not agree more with. And I actually find the notion that friendships, the notion that they shouldn't be based on some sort of mutual utility, I find that idea absolutely preposterous. And I always have done, I've always, found that there's no irreconcilability between someone being a good, dear friend on one hand and having something to offer you, something practical and of utility to help you on the other hand. But apart from being a useful, helpful friend, what are some of the other, let's call them friendship hacks, we can introduce into our lives, and how do these tap into the ancestral nature of human affiliation and kinship?
So before we move to that, let me just say one thing. That the other thing that was fun about writing this book is that we have these I love writing popular books because it's not like writing a journal article where you have to be just sort of like bare, boring factoids and then statistics. We use the example of Kahneman and Tversky in that book, in that chapter. And, Danny Kahneman was a Jewish kid growing up in France when it was occupied by the Nazis, and he had to live in a little barn, run out of the city, lived in the countryside, hid in a barn, had no friends, apparently. And then he moved to Israel and got to be friends with Tversky. And that friendship ended up winning Kahneman a Nobel Prize, right? And, so I think, I just want to say it's kind of fun to think about that friendship, it made a big difference in the ancestral environment, but in the modern world, it's tremendously important to make sure Dave likes to say that one of the lessons of the whole book is to help other people climb up the pyramid. And being in the business world, that some people come in and think, oh, gee, I can be an asshole here because I've got talent, okay? But people are going to want to get rid of you. People, if you want to do well on your job, no matter how talented you are, form some alliances and help somebody else. Help other people, and that will help. That's the best way to help yourself, rather than to show off, hey, I'm the greatest around here and screw the rest of you, which was the model in New York when I grew up. It's not a formula for success.
No, I would agree.
And I was going to say, if you want some real quick practical ways, sharing food is a really good way to make friends, and also noticing similarities, right? When you think about Kahneman and Tversky, they had very similar interests despite different backgrounds. And so those are two sort of ancestral ways to start making friends, and then combined with being useful, that's a decent foundation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like too many people in modern times, they feel like friendships are things that are supposed to endure just cause. Like the passage of time is enough to uphold a friendship. That the longer a friendship is, or has been, by definition, the stronger it is. And I think I'm not sure where the evidence lies on this front, but I suspect much of the time a friendship is only going to be a robust friendship because it has been a friendship for so long. But then I've had plenty of experience in my own life, and I've heard this from clients, that sometimes they don't really know why they hang on to the friendships that they do, even though they've been persisting for 30, 40 years. They'll just come to an epiphany one day where they're like, well, I've been mates with this gal for 30, 40 years, and they're not really contributing anything to my life. They're not really contributing anything to my well-being. I just feel like at this point, it's kind of a shitty dick move to kind of, abscond from the friendship. I think people get themselves into that kind of state of mind when it comes to friendship. I do think there are benefits to long-term friendships. I think also, when you think about the ancestral environment versus the modern environment, face-to-face friendships really make a difference. The more face-to-face time you can spend, because I could see with somebody you've known for a while, it does engender a certain amount of trust. And because your relationship styles change depending on how well you know a person. And so most of the time, I would think somebody you've been friends with is probably not going to have as much of a transactional relationship with you as somebody you've just met, right? And so as a general rule, I would sort of push people towards maintaining those long friendships, unless there's sometimes I think people can take advantage of that, the fact that it's not a transactional friendship anymore. And so, but
yeah, you can be exploited sometimes, but I'd say mostly I agree with Dave in that just the advantage of long-term relationships is that we trust the other person. We know they're not just sort of fly-by-night going to sneak in and steal something from us and leave. And in fact, the biggest piece of advice that you can get from the social psychology of long-term relationships, both friendships and romantic relationships, is don't count. You shouldn't be paying attention to what you're getting out of this relationship, because it turns out that just having somebody there when you need them, our editor, editors are mostly females, I think, these days. And, and our editor said, this whole bit about working together, that sounds like a real male thing. That women form friendships that are not based on working together. But I would actually say that there is actually something that she might not have been thinking about when she said that, which is that we get emotional support. Like if you look at what women do for one another, they help each other, take care of their kids. They advise one another on how to get along in relationships. And they're still, even if they're not building a house together, okay, or going out, to make a scientific discovery. Although one of the examples in the book is Eve Curie, who did win a Nobel Prize, but she was working with her husband, okay? But I think that even in those other kinds of friendships where we're not really building things together, it's nice to have somebody who's just there as a shoulder to cry on, even if we might not need it for a few years. But there's that comes that time when you're really lonely and miserable, and it's really great to have somebody who you can trust.
Yeah, for sure. And frankly, I don't see the idea that you should value utility and usefulness in a relationship as irreconcilable with this notion that you shouldn't be keeping score, as you put it, right? Like you can kind of just like recognize what someone brings to the friendship in a kind of everyday sense without keeping this like running score in your own mind of, well, have they done as much for me as I've done for them? You know, like a natural organic friendship is gonna, you know, those
exactly.
the uneven let's call them the uneven contributions to the friendship. They're gonna get buffed out over time. You know, if the friendship is strong, you're not gonna need to keep score in some important way.
Right.
Do you mind if I ask you, Gareth, what sort of friendship conflicts do you come across with your clients?
A lot of the time, I think the big one, it's not so much a friendship conflict, but kind of a almost like an expiration on the value of the friendship. Like some people I know will talk about you know, the person that they grew up with who still lives 2 miles from where they grew up. They still do exactly the same thing. You know, we're talking about sort of people mostly in their kind of 40s, 50s here, I would say. They still have all the same aspirations in life. They have no ambition to kind of fly the coop or do something different. And whenever my client in question will go back and visit this person, they will simultaneously be overjoyed that they get to see this person again because they've known them for so long, and yet at the same time somewhat depressed that this is all they've amounted to, and somewhat relieved that they now have this more distal relationship with them. That, you know, that the friendship is enduring, but it's kind of enduring just cause in a lot of ways. So I think people have real inner conflicts in their own mind about that. About, you know, well, you know, is the fact that this person is a good friend of mine just cause, is that good enough? Or do they have to represent some additional value or contribution to my life in order for me to justify maintaining the friendship in any kind of active way?
Interesting. The two things when I think about that, one is if they've moved apart, right? Once you've moved physically apart from somebody, it becomes a lot harder to maintain a friendship. And then the other thing, sort of going back to this sort of pyramid of needs, is a lot of times there'll be conflicts between things like affiliation and status, right? And sort of trying to figure out how to balance those, I think, is one of our biggest modern problems. And that can be really tough when people have had differing, throughout their life, they've gained differing amounts of status, and trying to sort of balance that. I don't actually know exactly what the solution is there, but other than just sort of to maybe think about, all right, what am I gaining from this in terms of status and in terms of affiliation and maybe in terms of these other sort of aspects of life?
Yeah, and look, this cues us up beautifully for the next chapter about status. The title of the chapter is Getting Ahead. This one, I think, for my audience, is perhaps the one that many of them might find of, you know, greatest concern or salience. We hear a lot about things like finding your passion or your purpose, person-job fit, person-organization fit, the importance of personal discipline and grit and conscientiousness and so forth. And I mean, how does one put together a plan of attack for oneself in order to get ahead in their life and career in the modern world in a way that is consistent with the mental firmware that we've kind of had grandfathered in from yesteryear? When, you know, like professional aspirations of the kind that would be salient for us now were not a concern.
Right. I mean, so one of the big mismatch here is our ancestors had maybe 3 levels in their little, you know, tribal groups, and we have people, you know, like these billionaires who make, you know, basically make thousands of times per day what their employees make, and then all the other kind of levels in between. So there's a lot of levels. The other thing is our ancestors all more or less did the same thing. Okay, you know, they fished They dug roots. They hunted together. Okay, they made huts, and they all did everything, a little bit of everything, more or less. And now there's this specialization. So, like the U.S. Census Bureau has a list of I don't know. It's just hundreds and hundreds of different job titles that you can possibly have. And so one of the first questions is, well, how do you we opened that chapter discussing my colleague Bob Cialdini, who's our co-author on a social psych book. And he's kind of well known amongst the business community. His book on influence sold like 8 million copies or something. But he was originally going to be a baseball player, and he was just about to sign a contract to play minor league ball. But fortunately, the story was that the guy signing him up, his pen broke, and said, "Hey kid, before you sign this, are you good at school?" And he said, "Yeah, good enough to go to college? Yeah, good enough to graduate?" He said, "Well, yeah, if you are, you're not that great at baseball. You're going to be minor leagues for the rest of your life. And so why don't you do something different? Go to college, kid." And so he goes to college, and he has a tremendously successful career, but that's a really interesting thing, is that we face, first of all, first question, what are you going to do? And with all of that occupational choice, I actually think it's, and maybe Dave may disagree with this, you have to make some trade-off between the amount of money you're going to make and the fit with your particular personality. That I think it pays to look for something that is going to get you a job, okay, but that still allows you to do something that, like, so Dave's younger brother, he's artistically inclined, okay, so we're talking about what's a good occupation. He also liked, he's very good spatially and with, Legos as a kid. And so he's going to major in architecture, which is a nice combination of kind of engineering skills, which make you money, and art, which doesn't make you very much money. And so, that's first the question is how to find the right occupation. And we often don't look carefully enough at the beginning. We used to just ask, well, how much money does this make?
I want to jump in here because I want to frame this a little differently. So when you think about ancestral status, right? I think a lot of times people think it's just, based on your size or whatever, but it really a lot of times comes down to what can you do for the group, right? So if you're big, you can protect the group, right? Or you can get food for the group. And so I actually think when people are trying to figure out how to attain status right now, I think in the modern day, I think there's this push towards find your passion. And I would say, like, you had talked about sort of person job fit. I would almost consider like person goal fit. Like if you think about these fundamental goals, think about how can you help other people achieve these goals? And when you look at Bob Cialdini, the reason he probably would not have been as successful of a baseball player is that the need of people who can show people how to play baseball is pretty full, right? There's more people doing it at a really high level than there's really an evolutionary need to do that. But people who can tell us how to succeed in business, that fulfills a status need. So I think thinking about, especially for people who are trying to figure out their initial career or a career change, what could I do that will help someone else fulfill this need, fulfill one of these sorts of needs, and that I would feel passionate about, I think would be a very good place to start.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think actually that's an important insight when it comes to just how, in my mind, how misframed some of these ideas around person job fit and person organization fit are. Like, people really are treating themselves as square pegs that they need to jam into a round hole at every single opportunity. And the incentive structure in society is such that we have round holes everywhere for which, some amount of the square pegs simply are not going to fit. Just running the numbers, there's going to be some, appreciable percentage of society that are just not going to find a way of, lubricating themselves enough to jam themselves into that hole. So,
I was going to say, we also have a lot of, like, if you think of this career board, there's certain holes that are already, they got enough pegs, right? And so then that might not be the right choice, even if it seems like the right fit otherwise. So
yeah, one other thing in that chapter that we get into is, so let's assume you've got a good career, and you've done well at it, and you want to move up in the ranks, okay? You want to move into leadership. And one of the things that that I think an evolutionary perspective has offered us is there's a lot of research being done now on this distinction between dominance and prestige. So people, the first take on evolutionary psych is, well, we're like chimpanzees, and so there was the guy, I forget his name, but he was the Republican leader of the U.S., House of Representatives, and he used to give people the Chimpanzee Politics book,
Gingrich.
Duvall's book, Newt Gingrich, and say, this is what it's like. You just got to go for power. You got to go, take, go for power, conquer other people. And that's a terrible message, really. As it turns out that, there is, actually one of my graduate students is now doing research on this, but it's like, if you look at the research on dominance and prestige, so dominance is that the chimpanzee, be an alpha chimpanzee, be a bloodthirsty son of a bitch, and stomp on other people and scare them away, make them, afraid of you. Then the thing that, Joe Henrich and Francisco Gil White published this very influential paper, maybe now 20 years ago, on the distinction between dominance and prestige. Besides dominance, humans also have a path to power based upon the fact that we are knowledge-gathering organisms. And so if you can gather a lot of knowledge, this is what Cialdini did. He didn't beat people up. He was apparently a tough kid in his neighborhood, but he didn't go out and beat people up. He provided tremendous amounts of information to people. And so when people have the right information, when they're prestigious, when they really know how to do what they're doing, and when they're willing to share it, other people want to be near those people. And then other people want you in a position of leadership because they trust you to do a good job. Okay. And so a strongest recommendation from an evolutionary perspective is, if you want to lead, go for prestige. Don't go for dominance. Don't be a bully. Don't be an asshole. Okay, be the person, be knowledgeable, and be willing to help the group.
Yeah, that's such sage advice. And personally, I can't get past the image of Newt Gingrich actually offering up a book on evolution to his House colleagues. That seemed, talk about crossing the aisle. That seems totally incongruous with what I would imagine Gingrich to be all about. But nonetheless, a good plug for Dewall there. Now, the next two chapters in the book are all about falling in love and staying in love, or not, but still acquiring a mate and retaining a mate. Love, sex, how it all hangs together differently for different people. Doug, I know how many runs on the board you've amassed in your career on this wider topic. I've seen you speak. We were at the same conference together in upstate New York a few years ago. I saw you speak on this topic. And among all the areas that evolutionary psychology explores, this one really is, in some sense, the most germane and the most, functionally fundamental. So what are some of the most important things that latter-day humans should consider in pursuing the targets of their affections, and just how fraught, you mentioned OkCupid at the top of the show, just how fraught is the landscape of modern love and sex with pitfalls that could derail our best romantic intentions?
Let me just say, so Dave, you may want to jump in on this, but I gave a talk to a social psych conference recently about this book before it came out, and one of the things Dave pointed out to me is that when you go online and you look up evolutionary psych, you see that in some sense, it's almost like the public's view of evolutionary psych is like Hugh Hefner or Genghis Khan. It's like going out and conquering and then getting laid as much as you possibly can because, well, that's what our genes tell us to do, right? And in fact, it turns, of course, if you know evolutionary psych, not at all. We're designed to actually form pair bonds, okay? And we're not, although some small percentage of males might have gotten to live like Genghis Khan, it was a dangerous life to live because more Genghis Khans were killed than got away with what he got away with, okay? Promiscuity is now, and maybe I'm an old guy, and so I'm an old guy from the hippie 60s, right? When in fact promiscuity was considered the in thing to do, when Hugh Hefner was a cultural icon, right? And I think that some people, given all the freedom you've got now, people think, oh, gee, this is great. Okay, let's use what we know about what makes people attractive to go out. And in fact, one of my colleagues, who I won't name, actually published a book with one of these kind of pickup artists about how to use evolutionary psychology to pick up a maximum number of women. And so, Dave, you can talk about that because.
So I do think that this is a really interesting topic because I think evolutionary psychology has had a big impact on the way we date already, and in some ways, it may have caused its own modern problems. I've talked to people who say, yeah, so my job, this was a guy I was talking to, he's like, when I date, it is my job to objectify the woman and try to get sex with as little input of resources as possible, and it's her job to try to maximize as many resources as she can from me, and that's the battle. And it's like, that's not, first of all, no, like that's not the way that, things are designed to work. It's not like these sort of like fly-by-night relationships are very rare in the ancestral kingdom, right? And you would probably know the other people or know where to find them to get to have them help with caring for offspring. And also, there's always this talk going back to like the selfish gene about this idea of, are we just in it for ourselves? But really, it turns out, even if our genes are in it for themselves, we as a species, it pays to sort of look out for other people. So I'm having trouble trying to figure out exactly what to say, because the one last thing I've noticed is there's also been a pushback against this now, right? There are these sort of books like, Jordan Peterson's book and like The Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century. I like both books. They both also are like, well, instead do this other thing. And it turns out that one of the main things, one of the reasons we have big brains is we're designed to adapt. And what's right for me might not be right for you. And what's right for one woman might not be right for another woman. So it's really, as tempting as it is to be like, oh, don't pursue short-term relationships or only pursue short-term relationships, I still think the best advice is just assess what you really want. And then there's choices you can make based on that. So,
yeah, I agree that it's so idiosyncratic. I mean, just to give you relate an anecdote from my own experience. When I first moved to America, I was relatively newly single, and Tinder had started to become something of a thing. It wasn't brand new, but it was relatively new. And, without wanting to, trivialize or depersonalize or dehumanize any single person, for me, particularly, I think no disadvantage being a foreigner in this game as well. But I mean, it was like shooting. It was like
having that accent.
Yeah, the accent certainly helped. Point of difference, point of scarcity, and so forth. But like having Tinder to me really was, although it was, again, without dehumanizing, although it was a lot like shooting fish in a barrel in terms of, the success rate that I got out of what I wanted to use the app for, which is just hooking up. For me personally, it was too much of a good thing. It was like having a Burger King, 100 meters down the road on the corner or something like that.
It's like the Elvis Presley problem with mates in some sense, right? It's like too much. It's like Ben and Jerry's at the mating market, right? Too much.
Yeah, exactly.
So what in what sense would you say it was too much of a good thing? Like what?
Too much of a good thing. To go back to your point about this being quite idiosyncratic and particular to the individual in question, I have no doubt that for other guys or other people, that there could have been no functional upper limit to how much value and how much utility they could have got out of Tinder, right? That for them, non-stop hooking up and just, like sampling from the smorgasbord at will ad nauseum could have been perfectly congruent with their life and the optimization of their life. But for me, I knew that too much of this was going to make me too comfortable with the idea of sex and hooking up is just transactional, and it was going to derail me from what I suspect and what I now know were my longer term aspirations and values of finding a long-term mate, securing a long-term mate, and now finding myself happily married to my wife. I just saw the writing on the wall for how it was going to, you know, scupper my own best laid plans for my future.
One thing I do want to say to guys out there, because I was on Tinder for a while, and I think, actually, this isn't just for guys, this is for everybody. I think that there is now this sort of idea that, look, to prove you're a successful guy, you have to be pursuing short-term relationships, right? And I kind of hate that, because, like, for me, the idea of if I hook up with somebody and then they have a kid, I want to know where that kid is, right? I actually think I am fairly paternal, right, in my mindset. And so, while I can certainly see the appeal, right, like the sort of momentary appeal, I can see the appeal of hooking up with someone quickly. The appeal of then moving on to the next person is not as appealing for me, because I'm like, hey, I want to know. And I think that this idea that the true male perfect life strategy is maximize number of opportunities, I'm not sure that is as scientifically sound as people think. So
I don't know, I actually don't know the research evidence on this, but I'm a child of the 60s, right? And so when the pill came in and when there was, you know, free love, to the extent to which there was ever such a thing, you know, but it was less costly love. But, you know, I found that during the periods of time when I was single and took some advantage of that, okay, I was never quite that charming, but I was charming enough, you know, and I found it to be unsatisfying. I mean, I just found it to be like, this is not, you know, I think, I hate to sound like an old man, you know, but it's like, I think we're designed to, you know, we are designed to form long-term relationships. We're designed to bond, you know, and it's a little bit unsatisfying to just have sex and then to move on and, you know, to not feel any affection and, you know, long-term connection.
I think it's the moving on part. I think it's the moving on part that people find tough, right? It's the I like, right, the idea of meeting somebody, having her like me, having me like her, having us have sex, all that's great. It's then the whatever the breakup or the all right, take it easy, like that's the part that always throws me off. And I think it's okay for that to throw people off. I think it's natural for it. Like there's free love did not exist in the ancestral environment, in the sense of like most of the time, if you're going to have sex, there's a pretty good chance, I mean, depending on menstrual cycles and things like this, right? But offspring is a safe assumption.
Yeah, and look, maybe it was free love within what you could call an extremely limited menu, right? It wasn't like free love within this like wide, expansive smorgasbord that we have now, where, you know, like, I mean, as a, you know, I spoke to Catherine Salmon a few weeks ago on my podcast, and, you know, we were talking about, you know, male usage of pornography and prostitution and things like that. That the fact that, you know, from a psychological point of view, a male can be exposed to more putatively willing and receptive females in the space of 1 hour than an ancestral human would have had access to in their lifetime, or perhaps several lifetimes over. You know, there is something not quite aligned with those two pieces there.
Yeah, because, I mean, what happened is the natural setup in the past would have been you would find the mate, you would have a connection, and it would develop into something. And so, you know, pornography, again, it seems good in the abstract. It's like Ben and Jerry's. It's like, Jesus, here's sweet food to eat, okay?
Yeah,
and it's
exactly.
more or less free. But then it turns out that naturally speaking, we are designed to start forming bonds. You know, I mean, I remember being a young person and having one of my few one-night stands, and we were in different countries going different directions, but I still felt a little bit, you know, sad at that at having to say goodbye to this person. This was just something where we knew we were going in different directions at a different, in the time of hippiness. But I think it's just, we didn't, in the ancestral environment, we would have hung around and we would have bonded with one another. And that feels good. That's part of how we're designed. And I Gareth, when you say this, maybe for some guy it would be, I've met a lot of guys from the 60s, and I've never met anyone who was perfectly comfortable with just promiscuity and nothing else. Sometimes people are comfortable with a little bit of relationship on the side, okay? But I don't know somebody who just wants to be single and have partner after partner after partner. I've never met that guy.
Yeah, and look, just to go back to that study that you alluded to previously about the pickup artist community. I don't know where the where the evidence lies, or if any evidence has been sort of cashed out to support this one way or another. But my hunch, my kind of pre-hypothesis, is that only a very small percentage of that community, if you sort of longitudinally followed up with them 10 or 15 years later and assessed what their life satisfaction was like, I would imagine only a small percentage of them would be satisfied if they are still living that pickup artist lifestyle after 10 or 15 years. I would imagine that for the vast majority of the non-clinical population, people who are psychologically healthy and well-adjusted, that there are going to be, really hard limits about how long you can push that pickup artist lifestyle before it starts, before everything comes home to roost and you start to have some, malaise that develops because of that.
I mean, even if, I don't know if you've ever read the book, The Game, but like he talks about Mystery crying on the floor, after his relationships all fall apart. And it's like, so it seems like from the get-go, it always had this, this downside. And I think the one other thing where I think that psychology has sort of added to this modern problem is, we've talked about, I don't think this was in the book, but in the talk, we talk about this idea that when there was a study at the petrified forest where they had signs up that said, if everybody takes a stone from the petrified forest, there'll be no stones left in 2 years, right? This was to stop people. And people took more stones because they were like, oh my gosh, everyone's taking stones. And I think that there has been this idea lately of everyone is out there everybody else wants to be having these short-term relationships. And that may not be that true, right? So again, I would say just people should think very carefully about, is this for me? And if it is, great, if it's not, then that's cool too. So.
And if it's not, I mean, and this, I think, segues us into and you guys have already been so generous with your time, I really appreciate this. It's just to segue things into the last question I want to pose to you about the last rung on the pyramid about family. This idea that, yes, it's great for some of us, and it's totally fine for some of us to be hookup-minded and effectively evolutionary dead ends. But we would like at least some of us, for the ongoing survival and endurance of our species, to be pursuing relationships that have more long-term gains than that. Let's say. So in a time where the word family itself can mean multiple things, it can take multiple forms, what is some of the most robust counsel that you guys could offer to those who want to maintain strong familial bonds, irrespective of the particular composition of their own family units and whether or not they themselves are actually parents or parents themselves?
So I have a couple that I could start with. I think one, so as we've mentioned in friendship, physical proximity is always nice. If you can visit your family, I think there's always this feeling, another norm of, you go off to college, like you've traveled all around the world, which I think has a lot of benefits, but I think sometimes there's also a lot of benefits to staying near family. And if you do travel, visiting family, I think, is really good. Not keeping track is another really of who owes who what, I think is a good one. And then the other thing we sort of talk about in the book is sort of keep your family in check, but also sort of protect them from the outside world. And we have some examples that aren't necessarily like they're good questions, but I don't know that they're the perfect examples of those. But I think those are the things: is, you know, look out, protect your family, look out for your family, and spend time with your family. And I would also give that advice even to people who are pickup artists, right? Even if you're not looking to have kids yourself, I would still say with members of your family and even with the general, you know, humans are pretty related as a species. So with other people, spending time. So
one piece of advice for long-term romantic relationships is, you know, when I was younger, during this period, the free love period, people used to say, you've got to do what's right for you. You've got to do what's right for you. And I think that's the shittiest piece of advice out there. You know, you've got to do what's right for your partner, you know, and if you're thinking about your partner and willing to take some losses, you know, to say, you know, one of my things, my little mantras inside my head with my wife is, look, Doug, you're wrong. Just begin with the premise that I'm wrong, and then I won't be fighting over nothing, you know. And if you do what's right for your partner and for your kids, you know, life goes a lot better for everybody. You know, things go you have much more smoother relationships when you're not asking, what can I get out of it, you know. And so, sort of to move to the very end of the book, one of the things we talk about is, if we took one piece of advice away from all of the stuff on evolutionary psychology, you know, it used to be people mistook us, we're the selfish genes people. You know, selfish genes, that means do selfish things, right? But no, selfish genes are selfish, but people are not designed to be selfish. People are designed to live in groups. And so what we point out at the end of this book is that our role model for a life well lived, it's not Genghis Khan, okay? It's a woman named Osceola McCarthy, and she never had any children, okay? But what Osceola did, she won the presidential medal, you know, when it still meant something, before it was ruined by one of our presidents a couple of years ago. But she won the presidential medal because what she did is, she was a washerwoman, and she washed people's clothes. She actually quit school to help one of her relatives. She had to help her mother and her aunt. And so she quit school in like the 6th grade, and she did laundry for her whole life. And she got to be into her 80s, and she had saved her dimes that she got from washing and pressing people's shirts. And she really enjoyed her work, incidentally. You know, and this is one of the other things about work. Whatever you do, enjoy it, you know. And she enjoyed her work. She took pleasure in, you know, cleaning clothes. It can be fun, you know, and it was fun for her. And she liked being out there, hanging the clothes on the line. And she accumulated a lot of money at the end of her life. She had the equivalent of what would be $500,000 today. And she didn't have any needs. She lived in a house that, you know, her family had given to her. You know, she had no bills. She didn't have a car. She didn't have a television set. She had an old black and white television set. She would walk, you know, to her church and help people there, you know. But the banker asked her, what do you want to do with your money, Osceola? How do you want to invest it? She said, I don't need all that money. I want to give it away. And here's a woman who dropped out of school in the 6th grade. She set up a scholarship fund for African-American girls to go to college, you know, to go, and then several very rich people matched her money, and this fund got to be very large. But, you know, so that, she's somebody who died happy, you know. She died with respect and, you know, with a standing in the community that you can't get from being personally selfish. So, you know, that's sort of our, you know, when I asked a bunch of people who I regard as very successful, famous biologists and, you know, famous psychologists and positive psychology people, you know, people, some of whose names you would know. And the biggest piece of advice that kept coming up from these older people was, for my kid, my younger kid, be nice to other people, you know. And that turns out to be, that's a very consistent with the way humans are designed.
And I think that's a thing people have heard a lot. And I think one of the things, if people read this book, think about not only, or if you are talking to people about this book through your work or anyone listening to the podcast, don't just think about these 7 things, how you can achieve them yourself. But if you think about how you can help other people achieve them, that's what, Osceola McCarthy did, and it worked out really well for her. I don't think she was thinking about it and she hadn't read our book, but that sort of idea of helping other people attain status, helping other people, helping family. If you just think about ways to help other people do that, I think it's a good way to lead a fulfilling life. So.
And look, I'm going to take your guys' cue and the exercise that you conducted on yourselves at the end of the book. What you're going to do tomorrow, the steps you're going to take. So I've decided to take up this challenge as well. And so I'm at the beginning of my day. So this is what I'm going to be doing with my day today. And just to your point, Dave, I think it's so important that the idea that if you follow these steps for yourself, you will put yourself in a better position to help others follow these steps as well. To me, it's kind of like an extension on the, in an airline, fix your own seatbelt first, then assist others. So the way that I'm going to fix my own seatbelt is I'm going to today eat a lean, nutrient-dense, high-protein meal after completing the 36-hour fast that I'm in the middle of, before going to the gym and lifting a bunch of heavy shit. I'm also going to avoid my Twitter like the plague because I don't need to post on it today, and that shit is just pure poison for the soul. I'm going to reach out to a work colleague with whom up to this point I've only kind of done the stupid monkey dance routine of, well, we really ought to go have a drink sometime. And I'm going to use that connection not only to facilitate a budding friendship, but to also help me in my clambering up the professional ladder and trying to achieve all that I want to in my work. I'm going to mentally note something I find truly awe-inspiring about my wife and let her know exactly that. And, hopefully that should prove sufficient to then secure a little something else later in the day. And I'm going to call my mum because she's cool and she helped ensure that the young male syndrome in me didn't get too out of hand. Still a work in progress. What do you guys reckon? Is that a decent agenda for the day ahead? And am I honoring and serving the ancestral me with this plan?
I think that's a great plan. I would challenge you tomorrow to also make a similar list and think about, for each of those things, how could you help somebody else achieve those? But I think that is a great list for you today. I like that you're calling your mom, and she should be proud of you. So
I will. I absolutely will. Yeah. I'm going to have to now. Awesome. Yes. Well, I do make a point of keeping in contact with her every week. I really am that kind of good son in that respect. So yeah, I like to think that last rung of the pyramid, I'm doing my bit to hold up my own end of the bargain there. So. But look, guys, I think this, to go back to the swinging 60s you're referencing, Doug, I think this brings us to the end of the tape reel. Of course, we're not quite as limited by the boundaries of analog these days, but I think it's a good point to wrap up the conversation. Guys, this has been amazing. The book, again, so fantastic and, had such a powerful impact on me, really resonated with me in so many of the ways that, that I mentioned earlier, but it really was like the perfect confluence of so many things that I obsess over and in my professional life, and I just am interested in generally in my personal and professional lives. So thank you for taking the time to write this book. Thank you for taking the time to be here with me today. And I'd love to have you back on anytime. All the very best with the book, and I know things are going to be firmly underway with that very, very soon. You'll be in the thick of promoting it and everything. So good luck with that, and just keep up all the excellent work that you do.
Thanks. You too. This was great.
Good. Buy a copy for your mom.
Yeah, I absolutely will. You guys have inspired me to do just that.
If you want us to sign it, send it our way. So
yeah, I absolutely will. Awesome, guys. Cheers again, and hopefully we'll talk real soon.
Great. Good talking to you, Gareth.
Thanks. Yeah, this was great, Gareth.
See you later.
Cheers, guys.
And they got me thinking.